This is a true story. One night, 17 kids walked outside, and they never came back.
Matthew, where are you?
A lot of people die in this story, in a lot of really weird ways. This is where the story really starts.
Weapons, rated R.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Kulturecast. I am your host, Chris Stachiw, and yes, this is another solo episode, just me here, talking about movies, or at least a movie. More specifically on this episode, I'll be talking about one movie that's kind of been resonating with me more recently, in positive and negative ways. But I wanted to talk about something first to lead into that. That's a little bit more kind of broadly, and then we can talk about a little bit more specifically about this movie, which I think is indicative of things recently. So in the last couple years, and it's been a while since this has been the case. It's been, I guess, probably 2014 was something like It Follows. And, even something like The Witch, which came out a year later, we have what is being called, and, which I think a lot of people, myself included, talk about with elevated horror, or horror being used to mean something. And, again, we as fans of horror, if you're listening to this show, I'm assuming you're a fan of horror. And if you're not, I understand why you might not be, but I actually think that these movies, for as much as I have an issue with them from time to time, as kind of being a little, what's the term, unsubtle. Some of these have, they're about as subtle as a jackhammer to the fucking forehead. Some of these movies, I mean, again, something like The Babadook, which I'm not personally a fan of. I know that there are plenty of people, especially I'm sure people that are listening to this, that are screaming into their headphones going, The Babadook is a great movie, Chris, you just don't understand it. It's just not for me. I know that it's a good movie. It's just not for me. It's not something that I personally resonate with, but I can also understand why other people might resonate with it. I don't have kids. I don't have any aspirations to have kids. And so I think maybe The Babadook would resonate with me more if I were a parent, and especially if I were a parent of a special needs child, because I think The Babadook, at least if memory serves, that was kind of the main point of that movie, is that the kid in that movie is, or at least coded as special needs. Again, I've only seen that movie once. It's not something I really have wanted to revisit. And I think that that's the other thing about these movies that are horror as X, or, processing grief through the use of horror or alcoholism, or in something like It Follows, STDs, sexually transmitted infections, I guess is probably what they're called now. Using horror movies as a vehicle for those things is interesting. And I am a huge fan of processing emotions and externally utilizing art to process emotions in a healthy and cathartic way. And, in my mind anyways, with something like The Witch or It Follows, or, again, maybe something, I don't know how unsubtle people want to go with something like this, but with something like The Menu even, or The Lighthouse, or Hereditary, or Midsummer, like all of those movies have something in common. That thing in common being the idea that there is something that the movie has a vested interest in getting the audience to understand, be it, the creature in the movie and It Follows is an STI, and, it's operating the way sexually transmitted diseases do. And so, you have this woman being followed by the STI the entire movie, as if it's herpes or AIDS or something to that effect. And again, like they thankfully in that movie, they never say, they just kind of, again, allude to, this is how it's transmitted. And so therefore, we're going to have it be an external manifestation of STIs and sexually transmitted diseases, and being ostracized for those things. Maybe not literally, but sometimes, figuratively or metaphorically. And I really, I don't have an issue with it. I think the issue that I have with it is when it starts to be the same message being regurgitated over and over again without anything interesting or novel in its delivery. I know I'll probably take some flack for this as well with something like Skinamarink, which I really enjoyed. It was one of the first things I bought in a physical media format when I kind of started rebuying physical media, thanks to a friend of the podcast and frequent collaborator, Ryan Verrill of Disconnected, and the Physical Media Collector. Like, I like Skinamarink because that's a movie that talks about child abuse and child neglect without really, again, beating you over the head with it. I think the problem most people had with that movie was less the message of the movie and more that the movie was just kind of esoteric in the way that it delivered the message. And, again, it's more of an art house movie. It's a small budget thing. It was, made by one guy. And that's it. Like, it's a very small scale project compared to something to even like The Witch, which, again, that is Robert Eggers' first film, but it had a budget of $4 million. Skinamarink, I don't even remember what the budget of Skinamarink is, but the budget of Skinamarink is not $4 million. There's no way the budget of Skinamarink is $4 million. The budget of Skinamarink was $15,000. So, that's a significantly smaller amount, but again, like, they're still trafficking in the same thing. They're both going out of their way to confront a certain message or idea or topic using the vehicle that is a horror movie. And again, the diminishing returns of it all, I think, is the problem for me ultimately. And the diminishing returns of it all is when someone does, again, the grief monster in a horror movie. Once again, just as a grief monster, you get something like The Boogeyman, which is a perfectly fine adaptation of a Stephen King movie, but it's rather pedestrian in what it's doing. It's grief. Grief is a monster. Mental health is a monster. Like, and I'm not saying I have an issue with it. As someone who struggles with their own mental health, as someone who went to get diagnosed this year and went and got a psych eval done, and now is in therapy every week. And my therapist said, hey, by the way, most people don't. And by most people, she'd never heard of someone going and getting psych evaled on their own volition. Most people do that because of a court order or because someone else says you need to go get it done. I got to that point on my own. I knew something was wrong. I knew something was not okay. And I knew I needed to go and do something about it. And that takes a lot. And, I wish I could say the same for everyone else. And if you're listening to this and you have mental health issues and you have insurance, you can probably talk to your doctor and say, hey, I don't think something is okay. If we can't do something with medication, which medication doesn't work for all of us, I know that because I took medication that caused me to have sexual impotency issues. It curbed my libido completely. It made me feel less than myself, which it's not something that someone who makes content for a living should be feeling, because not feeling yourself means you're probably not going to be honest with your audience or honest with yourself. And I think the best content comes from being yourself and being honest and being at least as honest as you feel comfortable being. I mean, again, I'm not saying I'm pulling punches here, but sometimes you have to speak a little bit more circularly than you can specifically because, again, people's feelings are involved, mine included. So, but if you're struggling with mental health and if you're struggling with not feeling okay on a daily basis, it's okay to go to your doctor or whoever, again, like you see for health issues and saying, hey, I need to be referred to someone to do a little bit more about this. There's nothing wrong with that because, again, not everybody has the outlet of art. And that's the thing that, someone like Robert Eggers or Zach Cregger or Ari Aster or, oh my God, so many of these directors right now. I mean, even Denis Villeneuve is, I mean, again, like, he has directed Dune, but he also directed Enemy, which again, like, he also directed Prisoners, which is kind of a horror. I mean, it's maybe not a horror movie, but it has, Weapons, the movie that I'll be talking about more specifically as this episode goes on. I think Weapons and Prisoners would be a very good, a very intense, at least in Prisoners respect, double feature, because it's about the loss of children and in a lot of ways the loss of innocence. In places where innocence doesn't necessarily need to be lost, especially with children in a in such a young age that, I mean, look, children disappearing is always going to be bad, but these are children from an elementary third grade class. So they're children under the age of 10. And that's, God, it's bad enough when it's one kid, but when there's 17 children disappearing from one class, that takes, I think, precedent over pretty much anything else. I think what's funny is obviously with something like Weapons, Weapons is a little more fantastical in the presentation of the world that we're in. In a lot of ways, I feel like Weapons almost doesn't exist in reality. Weapons exists in a heightened reality. I think Barbarian, a movie that I resonate with a lot less than Weapons, I think also existed in that heightened reality. And I think for me, when I was watching Barbarian, that didn't work for me in Barbarian, because in Barbarian, it felt like the movie would have worked better if it had been grounded further in reality and the kind of fantastical nature of, there's spoilers for that movie, and there'll be spoilers for Weapons as well from this point on. There's tunnels underneath this building, and oh my God, it's all underneath this, and there's Richard Brake, and like, it's just those fantastical elements didn't really jibe with the environment above ground, as it were. Those elements didn't work together. And in Weapons, there is that same nature of kind of the concealed truth that is lying just beneath the suburbia. And in Barbarian, it's the decayed, the dystopian suburbia. In Weapons, it's the suburbia of Blue Velvet. I mean, there's something very Lynchian in Weapons, and I'm not saying it's David Lynch in tone, but David Lynch was always interested in the world outside and the world beneath being incongruent with one another. And Blue Velvet, when Kyle MacLachlan finds that ear in the front yard, I mean, in suburbia, the last thing you would ever expect to find is a disembodied ear in your front yard. And in Weapons, we have the Austin Abrams character, the homeless drug addict and thief who spends most of the movie out of sorts, showing us what happens when your entire life is taken over by addiction and every single moment is spent looking out for yourself because society is, again, seemingly not looking out for you. And in this country, we have a really bad track record with taking care of people that are struggling with mental health. And we have an even harder time taking care of people that are struggling with addiction, because so many people can't even acknowledge that addiction is a disease and that it needs to be, treated, and that there are ways to help people with addiction and they don't need to be ostracized from society. And, that there are some people that, sometimes the addiction is just so overwhelming and so all encompassing that, sometimes there is seemingly no way out. And, those people need more help, and those people do need to be focused on more, because there are people that don't struggle from addiction at all. And congratulations. I'm not saying I do, but I struggle from mental health issues, which, are crippling in their own right. And so the thing that's interesting about something like Weapons is, similarly to Blue Velvet, similarly to Barbarian, but I think it works better in Weapons, is we see the undercurrent of the world that is seemingly on the up and ups and everything is perfect on the outside, but just below the surface, we have the Alden Ehrenreich character, who is kind of the personification of that. I mean, he has the perfect house, seemingly, with How Did This Get Made's June Diane Raphael, which I can't stand seeing her in anything. She is, look, though, How Did This Get Made of it aside, which I'm not a super big fan of, because again, just laughing, joking, numbnuts about movies for an hour and just not adding anything to the conversation other than tearing down other people's work for your own self-benefit is fine. And, again, there's a need and want for that in the world of podcasting, and we have a good time here at Weirding Way Media, but I'm not really interested in tearing other people's work down because I think it's funny. We can make jokes, and there are bad movies out there, objectively bad movies, that deserve to be poked fun at and asked, how the fuck did this get made? It's a good question. It's a worthy name for a podcast. I just don't think they ever actually answer the question. I think it's just about trafficking in their notoriety and fame, because lol, they're three celebrities who have a podcast, and that's why people are going to listen to it, because they're comedians and they have a leg up. Congratulations. I'm not a fan of her. I'm not a fan of her in this movie. I her scenes with Alden are fine. I like him a lot. He's like one of the best parts of that Han Solo movie, if not the best part of that Han Solo movie, a movie that is not I don't know. People have kind of forgotten that it happened, and that's probably the pre-pandemic of it all, but also the who really needed it and who really cares of it all. In retrospect, it's a lot more interesting and exciting than those 3 sequel films ended up being. And look, did we need a Han Solo movie? No. Did we need a Han Solo movie that answers the question of how did Han Solo get his last name? No. Did we need to see Emilia Clarke in the Han Solo universe doing Han Solo things? Alden Ehrenreich and her in that Star Wars movie, like they have zero chemistry together. But man, Alden Ehrenreich and Julia Garner, the little bit of time that they're on screen together, which is like 3 scenes in Weapons, the two of them have really great chemistry. I would love to see them in something else together, where they're given a little bit more time to play off of one another, because the two of them is great. You can actually completely understand why he would be so drawn to her, because the energy that she has is, she's one of the principal characters in the film. It's her and Josh Brolin and Alden Ehrenreich and then Austin Abrams. And then at the end of the movie, we get Carrie Christopher's Alex. But it's, again, like that's maybe my one kind of bigger issue with this movie is the long legs of it all. And we'll get to that when we get to that in terms of like criticism of the movie, or at least, like critiquing of the movie, less talking about the message and the issues that the movie's talking about. But I like the chemistry that Julia Garner has with everybody. I think Julia Garner is one of the best actresses working right now. I mean, from Ozarks to the Silver Surfer and Fantastic Four to this to, a lot of stuff, a lot of things I haven't seen, admittedly, like I know she was in The Americans. I know she was in Dirty John. She was Anna Sorokin in Inventing Anna, which I know, again, is kind of the thing that put her on the map for a lot of people, especially pandemic-wise. And the kind of accent that she was doing in that is kind of, I guess, has become kind of a meme unto itself. But I haven't seen Ozark, and this movie kind of would put me in the camp of going out of my way to watch it solely based on her performance and ability to act. And again, like, she's such a good actress, and it's almost unfair because there's so many actors working right now who are just so naturalistic, and she's one of them. Like, she just, it feels effortless the way she makes acting look. And I think that those are the people that inherently are the ones that are the most gifted, are the ones who, when you watch them act, it doesn't feel like a put on. You can see everything that the actor is trying to get across from the script on their face, and they add so much by just their sheer physicality alone and their presence on screen. And so many of the shots in the middle part of the movie, especially during the Justine Gandy parts of the movie where it's her narrative, are like close-up shots of her and her reacting to things and just giving Justine, or Julia Garner more specifically, the ability to react. And is she a scream queen? No, I don't think so. I mean, you have to be in more than one horror movie to do that. And look, I'm not a fan of Wolfman. I think Wolfman is a movie that, it came out earlier this year. I watched it. It's not terrible. I think there are some interesting ideas there. Obviously, essentially doing Wolfman as the Wolfman, but the Fly, which is what that movie is, which, again, I found to be an interesting premise. I'm not sure how well executed it is. That movie is also about generational trauma, because the father in the movie is the one turning into the wolf, and his dad turned into the wolf, but his dad was estranged from his family because his dad was a werewolf. It's werewolfism or lycanthropy for, deadbeat parenting, I guess. And, in Weapons, we don't get deadbeat parents in Weapons. We get helicopter parents in Weapons. We get justifiably pissed parents in Weapons. And that's where the Josh Brolin of it all comes in. Josh Brolin, who I love in everything I've ever seen him in. He is one of my favorite actors. He has an intensity to him that I really appreciate, and I think that his intensity, again, similarly to Julia Garner, it doesn't feel like a put on. And then when you see him in interviews on, Colbert, or anything really, any sort of kind of just Josh Brolin being Josh Brolin, I think that he really shines as an actor. Because he, and as a personality, even because he just seems, I don't know, he seems able to be serious, but also not take himself seriously, which, as someone who has been in things like No Country for Old Men, but then also I think has played one of, the great villains of all time with Thanos in a Marvel movie, I think, and he's like the quintessential Marvel villain at this point. And, Josh Brolin has so many roles at this point that you could say like, well, that's the role or that's the role. I mean, for some people, it will never be anything more than the Goonies, for fuck's sake. And again, I'm not a Goonies guy by any stretch of the imagination. Like I saw the Goonies way later in life. It's not a movie I grew up on. But again, The Goonies, similarly to Weapons, is a movie about heightened reality and broad stereotypes being painted, and those stereotypes existing as characters. We have the alcoholic, put upon teacher who's being accused of being a witch. We have the dad who wants his son back. We have the other parents in the town who are just, stricken with fear and grief, like Justin Long and Sarah Paxton showing up for a cup of coffee. We have, the gay principal and his husband who, are so empathetic to the Amy Madigan character who, is obviously there's something clearly up, but hey, you know what? Like we're going to be the good people that we are to the end, and we're going to be punished in a horror movie for being good people, which, does it suck? Sure. And I think it actually ups the ante of Benedict Wong's character. But Benedict Wong and Clayton Ferris playing the stereotypical gay couple, again, like nothing wrong with it, just like they're written so specifically that again, like it does feel like a fairy tale, almost like a modern day fairy tale. And I like that about this movie. I mean, I like that it feels like a modern day fairy tale. It feels very much like in the Ari Aster of it all. I mean, Hereditary. And especially, I mean, if you watch the director's cut of Midsommar, that movie is hardcore a fairy tale. I mean, they show the entire movie at the beginning of the movie in a fairy tale presentation with the kind of imagery and artwork of a fairy tale because it shows the entire story in picture book form. And then there's a part in that movie where we're kind of having this panning shot of the camera over these giant cloth kind of tapestries of the story of how one of the characters entraps the other character to fall in love with them. Like that movie is about the stories that we tell and the stories that are being told and the way we mythologize things. And, sometimes, sometimes it's a person being forced to jump off a cliff, and sometimes a person is jumping off the cliff of their own volition. And one of those answers is a little bit more romantic than the other, even if it's just as horrifying. There is a little bit of romanticism to the idea of, well, I'm going to turn 72 and I'm going to jump off of a cliff. Again, like I'm not agreeing with it, but Midsummer's kind of trafficking in the fairy tale nature of, kind of the narrative it's presenting. I think Weapons does the same thing. Maybe not as obviously, but you do have that opening framing device of the child narrator talking about, if you come to our town, you'll, and you ask the people who actually know, they'll tell you what happened. But if you were to ask the official, what's the official story? Nobody knows. And, I like that framing device. I know that the original version of the movie didn't have ending narration, which I think would have been interesting, but I think, to be fair, if you're going to put opening narration in the movie, you should probably put outro narration just to kind of wrap the movie up in one little tight, neat bow. And again, it gives you the opportunity to do something that the movie wouldn't necessarily allow you to do otherwise, which is contextualize what you're seeing externally, because most of, if not all of the story that we're seeing is being told from character, like the entire narrative, and the benefit of the narrative is the way that it's told, which is in a very non-linear fashion. I mean, we ping pong around from character to character to character to character to character. And there's nothing wrong with that. But because of the way you tell the narrative and because of the very narrow focus that each level of the narrative is given, we are intentionally not given all the information ahead of time. And for me, I appreciate that storytelling device, but I do feel like there is a little less of the gimmick of the movie will wear off in repeat viewings, because it has already worn off for me in repeat viewings as it is. Because the fairy tale of it, like there's some parts of the movie where I'm like, I don't I don't think that this is, works in any other way other than this like fairy tale aspect. And that's how I kind of have to convince myself of parts of this movie working better than others, because in something like Barbarian that doesn't have that laser focused tone, because it's able to meander a little bit more because it's being told in a more narratively straightforward, linear fashion. This movie doesn't have that. And because it doesn't have that, it is a little bit more obtuse with what it's doing, but it does require at the end of the movie the kind of once we have the key put into the lock, that we discover, okay, this is the dodge here. This is what we're all waiting for, the reveal. What's the reveal? How has the trick been pulled over, our eyes? What is the wool here? What is going on? It feels a little bit like Longlegs, and I wasn't necessarily a fan of it in Longlegs, and I'm not necessarily a fan of it here, where we just have the entire movie recontextualized in one 10-minute scene. And in this movie, it does the same things as Longlegs, like in the end of the second act, beginning of the third act. In this movie, it's an extended third act, about 30 minutes, with Alex's story. We learn why Alex has been the way he's been and what's been going on and why he didn't disappear, and who is this, redheaded woman we've been seeing the whole movie. Like, some of that's answered early on when we see Marcus going after, Justine, when we see Benedict Wong going after Julia Garner's character, and we understand that's what's going on, and she's, but we don't understand who she is really and what her deal is really. We can guess, we can make leaps, but in the third act of the movie, they pretty much just lay it all out. And again, there's got to be a better way to do it. Maybe not, and maybe it doesn't bother anybody, and maybe it's the how done it, who done it, how catch 'em of it all, and it's like, well, maybe did you figure it out along with the movie, or are you behind, and is the movie going to reveal something to you that you didn't realize? Like, again, that's kind of what it feels like. I'm not a huge fan of just laying it all out. And, there's subtle scenes in this movie, like a shot of the back of Josh Brolin's pickup truck with the paint, making it clear that he's the one who painted Witch on the side of Julia Garner's car. Like, there are subtleties in this movie that the movie knows it can do. They keep mentioning parasites on the TVs over and over again. I mean, at some point that feels a little more unsubtle than it does subtle. But, those kinds of things in the movie work for me better than just going and blah, we'll just lay it all out and have one character just regurgitate essentially what the director's point is, or the kind of who, what, where, when, and why, and now we'll let it go. I'm just not a big fan of it because it grinds the momentum and the tone of the movie to a halt. And I vibe with the tone of this movie a lot, because again, it does feel like elevated fairy tale storytelling, and at least the way that these kinds of movies can. The tone of this movie feels very heightened, just like the Goonies. I mean, the Goonies, in the Goonies, the kids run into a monster, sloth underground. Like that, again, like that. That's a heightened reality. Always going to go live with them forever. And then again, in this movie, at the end of the movie, we have the kids being returned to their families, but, some of them don't have the ability to speak again, and some of them do. And, the kids' parents at the end of the movie, Alex's parents, they're put in an institution. And it's just kind of like, all right, sure. Like that, there's no stakes to that. There's no, I don't know, like, there's no stakes to it, because it doesn't need to have stakes. It just needs to be a fairy tale. And that's the thing about this movie that's hard for me to kind of wrap my head around in the third act, is if it's a fairy tales aren't about over-explaining things. Fairy tales are about a message being kind of conveyed to the audience. And I think in a lot of ways, Zach Cregger should have trusted his audience just a little bit more, and maybe broken the Alex narrative into smaller bits throughout the movie, and not just weighed it down at the end of the movie where we have to have everything explained now. Like, having Amy Madigan flashed on screen throughout the movie, I think was good enough. Like, I don't need everything explained for me. And I like Amy Madigan a lot in this movie. I just think in a lot of ways, like, her and Alex back and forth is just like exposition, back and forth and back and forth. It's like, I'm not here for this, because this isn't what I vibed with the movie. I vibed with the tone of this movie a lot. I vibed with the fact that we have parents looking for kids, and the parents are stricken with grief to the point of not being able to, with Josh Brolin, he's unable to do anything else. And I like the idea of, the third act of this movie, Zach Cregger has said, is very autobiographical because he had alcoholic parents. And, that's an addiction, and it's an addictive quality that makes you an alcoholic. In Josh Brolin's case, he's addicted to grief. He's addicted to the hunt and the search for his son. And you see that throughout his whole narrative. We see him sleeping in his son's bed. We see him essentially not going to work. We see him sitting in front of his computer looking at these videos of the kids running into the distance with their arms kind of askew. Like, all Josh Brolin does the entire movie is look for his son. He is singular focused and narrow-minded in cause. And I think for me, that really works in the movie because we get the addiction narrative at the end of the movie with Alex's parents and, him feeding his parents and, having to take care of them. But we also get to watch Josh Brolin, who was clearly the breadwinner for his family, not taking care of himself and what that means for his relationship and his household, him not taking care of himself because he is only focusing on where his son is, which again is understandable given that his son disappeared, and the longer it takes after someone disappears to find them or to find a lead, the less likelihood that they're alive. I mean, that's the other thing. Like, obviously unrealistic that these kids would even be alive at this point. But, again, it is a movie, and nothing wrong with movies trying to be a little less realistic. But yeah, I mean, this movie is about witches ultimately at the end of the day. And not only is it about witches, but it's about how witches weaponize and are weaponized by either, again, if we look at something like Salem Witch, the idea of someone being a witch was a tool that was used to weaponize society against people to then use that witch or being a witch as an excuse to, take people's land away and murder them and have them burned at the stake or stoned to death. And that's the weaponization of people against one another. But then in this movie, the title of Weapons is about the idea that this woman, Gladys, the aunt of Alex, though it's never actually confirmed that she's his aunt or anything of relation, we just get the sense that, oh, well, there's this woman, like, again, we don't know if her powers are so far reaching that she could have convinced these people externally of who she is and weaseled her way in. I mean, again, she is, if the movie's narrative is to be believed, she is a parasite. So the idea that this woman comes into this town and takes over with such ease and takes over this household and causes such a problem and such a nightmare for this town. And then in the process of utilizing a child as a weapon against his own classmates, because she asks Alex, if you don't help me get pieces of each of your schoolmates' clothing or hair or personal effects, if you don't get me something, I'm going to kill your parents. I'm going to let your parents eat each other, because she's essentially a parasite. She's a flatworm. She's a tapeworm. She's draining his parents to stay alive, because we get the sense that Gladys is hundreds of years old, at least, I would assume. I mean, again, the movie does a good job of subtly getting us to these points. The movie doesn't need to explain everything. And again, I think some of this is just, Zach Cregger having to make changes based on studio notes. I mean, again, the ending being a little bit more subtle than it is now, with narration, with no narration before and narration now. Again, I enjoyed the narration because it does fit the circular kind of storytelling, someone telling a story, opening it, and then, it cutting back out of the story at the end, back to just the narration. It does work for me, but also it again over-explains everything. And I appreciate, again, the David Lynch of it all, not explaining everything, because I, as an audience member, I'm engaged. I am genuinely directly engaged with the movie, and the movie does not need to worry about me not being engaged. But I also understand that, there is a possibility that not everybody's going to be engaged, and that might be the problem. That could be an issue. And if you want to make sure people are engaged, you maybe need to drip feed them a little bit more, and a little less esoteric would be a lot more helpful for mainstream audiences. And look, this movie, $38 million budget, box office, $260 million. That's a lot of money. It's a success, one of the biggest successes of this year. Horror movies are I mean, horror has broken through from being just a genre that has been looked down on by the kind of cognoscenti of Hollywood because, people just get their start in horror and it's one peg above porn. Like, no, it's not one fucking peg above porn. Horror, in a lot of ways, and at least in my opinion, I think horror is the genre that still has the longest legs because it allows you to either subtly or unsubtly, directly or indirectly, address things that other movies can't do in as entertaining a way as horror. Now, look, maybe, a Marriage Story isn't necessarily going to have, a movie that talks about divorce that isn't a Marriage Story may not have as much legs to it as a Marriage Story in terms of getting the message across, but a horror movie about divorce and a falling apart marriage would probably be a little bit more entertaining, at least, or maybe a little bit more fun, I think. Because that's the thing about weapons. At the center of it, weapons is about 17 children disappearing. In this country, where people seem to not care about children at all because we allow things like weapons to, weapons, the actual thing. And as a gun owner, I have mixed feelings about a lot of this because, I am a responsible gun owner, like most gun owners are, because again, most people don't, it's always a smaller percentage of people ruining it for the greater percentage of people, obviously. And as a responsible gun owner of a weapon, as this movie so clearly points out, people in this country feign, they do performative theater about grief. And, the thing about Josh Brolin's character in this movie is it's not remotely performative at all. Like you get, because he's all consumed by the grief. But, there's performative grief in this country because we don't seem to care about children dying in school shootings when weapons are used. And again, kids in this movie are being turned into weapons. Normally, weapons are being used on kids in these school shootings. That's the thing. Weapons are being used by sometimes adults, sometimes other kids on other kids. And, again, the weaponization of Alex by Gladys so that he can hurt his classmates so that she doesn't hurt his family is, again, like it's chilling, it's haunting, but again, it does cut back to the idea of what is the theme of the movie? What is the point of the movie? And the point of the movie is, trauma comes from all directions. And, we can either have trauma put upon us by other people, like, again, Gladys doing to all the parents in this town, taking their children away from them in the middle of the night. And again, if not for the fact that Josh Brolin and Julia Garner are able to figure out what's going on, because even the cops are so inept, they can't figure it out. If not for the fact that they figure it out, these parents would still be without children. Gladys puts trauma on these parents that would have never gone away. And then, you have the self-trauma of, again, the addiction angle with the Alden Ehrenreich character and the Austin Abrams character of, a ex-alcoholic and a current drug addict. And what does that mean for what does that mean for them, and how, and are they more susceptible to being weaponized because of the kind of inherent kind of vulnerability of who they are just by their addiction? And, it would seem that while the movie doesn't necessarily outright or, like explicitly say that, it is kind of interesting to note who is weaponized in this movie easily. And the people that are easily weaponized in this movie are the cop who's an ex-alcoholic and the drug addict who's homeless. They seem to be the ones that were easily weaponized while, everyone else she had to work a lot harder. Like Gladys had to work a lot harder for Alex's parents than she did for James and Paul. She had to work a lot harder for Marcus. She had to really weasel her way, like a vampire into their house. And man, the scene with Marcus and his husband and Gladys, again, it's the most uncomfortable scene in the movie where he is headbutting his husband to death. It's not great. It's hard to watch. I would say it's the Talk to Me scene of this movie, the scene in Talk to Me where they're performing the seance and the younger brother gets in on it. Like that scene in that movie, that's this scene in this movie. Marcus headbutting his husband to death and then continuing to go further and further and further and further and further it's a lot. And, again, this is still a horror movie, but it, there is a little bit of comedy to it. And I do think that it's intentional that they give these characters these absurd kind of like popped out eyeballs. I mean, we've seen influencers on TikTok and YouTube who can kind of pop their eyes out of their sockets, and they do it to, comedic effect. And in this movie, it's gross and it's weird, but it is comedic because watching Benedict Wong run down the street with his arms at his side with his eyes popped out, kind of with his kind of rictus grin, it is funny to see. Like, it is also horrifying, but it's kind of like, it's darkly comedic. And that's the thing, like, Zach Cregger's tone in these movies is comedic in nature. I mean, he's, obviously this movie, and he's talked about it a lot, this movie was in a lot of ways him processing the passing of Trevor Moore, who is one of the founding members of The Whitest Kids You Know, who Zach Cregger was also a part of. So, catharsis comes in a lot of ways, and for Zach Cregger, it came externally in the form of weapons. And, he talks about the third act being autobiographical with the alcoholism of it all. But I think, less autobiographical and more just kind of broadly speaking to the idea of when something takes hold in your life, be it addiction, be it external forces that you can't get out from under, which again, could be addiction, could be a lot of things. It almost is all encompassing, and it takes over your life entirely, and it starts to poison and become parasitic in your life. And it starts to draw away healthy, positive thoughts and notions away, and it takes over and everything becomes toxic. I mean, when you look at something like Alden Ehrenreich's character, so he arrests Austin Abrams for trying to break into his job. He then, after getting stuck by a needle, punches Austin Abrams and then lets him go. And again, where we are at this point, his body cam caught all of this. So he tells him, look, you stuck me with a needle by accident. I punched you. Neither of these things are okay. And obviously one is worse than the other because he's a police officer. But again, you can kind of get yourself mentally to that point of, I've inflicted trauma on you. You've inflicted trauma on me. Let's just kind of call it good and walk away. They get to that point, and then Austin Abrams is trying to ostensibly do the right thing and let someone, in the police know, hey, this is where the kids are. I've seen the kids. These kids are in this basement. He wants the reward money, and God knows what he'll do with it. He'll probably just, again, like the character written rather sympathetically, he might go and use it on drugs, or he might go and get his act together. You would hope the latter, but it'll probably be the former. He's ostensibly trying to do the right thing, and Alden Ehrenreich kind of takes the wrong approach and doesn't listen to him because he thinks that he's trying to come back to the police station to report him for beating him up for, police violence and negligence. And that's not what he was doing. He was just trying to cash in on finding the reward for finding the kids. And so, because Alden Ehrenreich is, again, like he's a recovering addict, which, again, like it would seem that his ability to process things and his ability to be emotionally aware and, emotionally well balanced. Again, like the movie doesn't make a statement on how addiction factors into that, but Alden Ehrenreich is he's a loose cannon. I mean, and again, like addiction or not, like it seems that the addiction feeds into it. Like he makes one bad decision, then makes another bad decision, and then he goes out with Julia Garner making some more bad decisions, which seemingly like by the time the movie ends and he is shot dead by Julia Garner, like, it's because of a bunch of bad decisions that he kept making over and over and over again. Trauma over and over and over again, being inflicted upon him either externally or on his own. Like he does a lot of it to himself. He can't control himself enough to not punch Austin Abrams. He can't control himself enough to not go out with Julia Garner. Like there are ways to, as a police officer, make sure you are not, like you don't get AIDS or HIV, like getting pricked from a needle. Like, again, like, he obviously has every right to be upset, but he inflicts trauma on Austin Abrams and then makes things worse in the process on himself. Like there's so much of this movie that is just trauma being inflicted upon yourself by others and trauma that you inflict upon others yourself. And, I think it is time to talk about Gladys because, again, like the third act of the movie does really focus on her character. So Amy Madigan plays a witch in this movie, and Gladys, as a witch, uses other people's life force to drain them and or use them as weapons through kind of taking a piece of their like hair or belongings and then wrapping it around a branch and then breaking the branch and then that turning them into a weapon. And either, she can control them either to bring them to her or to send them to do her bidding. And she is obviously a malevolent force in the movie in a way that, again, you don't see in a lot of cinema. I mean, she is a very villainous character because she kills children and she's draining these children of their life force. And, that is, again, inherently the most evil thing you can do is anything that would be child focused or child centric. And using 17 children as essentially batteries to drain their life force for yourself is pretty intense. And I like the way she's written. I wish that there was, again, less of an explanation of what exactly she's doing. There's less explanation than I'm probably leading on, but I don't need as much as they gave because, again, like so much of it could have been conveyed with context clues and just the visual language of filmmaking. I don't need everything explained. But again, like there are these scenes throughout the movie before we kind of understand who she is, where we see her, in the background or in a dream sequence, and she has this wig, this really haunting like red wig, and she's dressed completely anachronistically to the time that this movie is taking place. The other thing about this movie, it's never really made clear when this movie is taking place. It feels timeless. And so that timelessness makes it feel like a fairy tale because the best fairy tales have a timeless quality to them that aren't focused on a specific time and place and year. And this movie feels that way. It doesn't feel like it takes place in a specific time and place. It just kind of takes place in any town in America is kind of the way it feels. And this town, is small town America, at least is the way it's painted. But the idea that the tenets of small town America are so fragile and that the framework of small town America is so kind of fragile and the nature of the foundation of it is really interesting because I'm not sure I disagree with the sentiment of the world of the nuclear family and small town America being very kind of tenuous at best. But at the same time, I do live in small town America, and there does seem to be that undercurrent in small town America of kind of passive aggressive toxicity. And there is some of that in this movie. I mean, the Alden Ehrenreich character is unable to be honest with his wife. And in not being honest with his wife about the things that he clearly like needs or wants, he is, able to go and be with Julia Garner and be an alcoholic and make bad decisions and, erode the nuclear family that he and his wife have together. And what's interesting is, again, in any movie without a supernatural character, we would just have parents and, cops and people in positions of power having their mental kind of faculties eroded by the grief and trauma and stress of being in this scenario. But in this movie, it's like, no, there's actually a supernatural explanation. This isn't the Atlanta child murders. This is a witch in small town America. And I like that about this movie because, again, like it doesn't trivialize the nature of the actual grief and trauma surrounding these things happening in the real world, but it does allow us to go, okay, the stakes are a little less than a man walking into an elementary school and gunning down children. There is a witch in this movie. There is a supernatural explanation. And that supernatural explanation may also have a supernatural kind of solution, a way to fix the problem. And there is a way to fix the problem. We see at the end of the movie, the Gladys character really gets her comeuppance, and she gets her comeuppance in a way that, like, I haven't seen in a horror movie in a very long time. Like, she gets ripped apart limb by limb. She gets her top jaw ripped off by children. Like, for what she inflicted upon these children inflict upon her in tenfold. And it's wild. And it's really, it reminds me of Colonel Rhodes from Day of the Dead. Like, it's very much like, choke on it. Like, help me. Like, there's something so visceral about being ripped apart by your bare hands, especially when it's like children, which is even more intense. But, the amount of trauma and grief that she inflicted upon them for the rest of their lives, because that's the other thing. When some of those kids come back at the end of the movie, some of them aren't able to talk anymore. And you wonder if that's because, like a battery, were those the first, were those kids the first ones to make it to the house, which means they were the first ones to be drained by Gladys, which means, there's less of their mental faculties left. That would be my explanation, at least headcanon wise, because, when you look at what happened to Alex's parents, they're institutionalized by the end of the movie. They were the ones who were being drained the longest of anyone other than those kids. So I would wager that that's the way the logic of the movie works. And, again, we don't understand, if someone like Benedict Wong had survived, would he have been continued to be drained? Probably. Or even someone like, Alden Ehrenreich or Austin Abrams, like if those characters hadn't been used for kind of nefarious purposes, so that Gladys could kind of have lackeys under her control, further weapons at her disposal, would she have drained them completely, and would they have, been used as batteries as well? Like when you're a parasite like Gladys, you don't see people as people, you see people as objects, you see people as means to an end, you see people as a tool for you to use for your own benefit. I mean, Gladys is a, case, positive, proof positive. She is a very good case study of a narcissist. I mean, that's the way narcissists treat people. Narcissists treat people as how can you do something for me? What can you do for me? How can you benefit me? What is there to be stood to be gained from me and you being friends or in a relationship? And that, for me, is again, the trauma in the lives that we live is, there are people that are alcoholics that inflict trauma on us. There are people that are narcissists that inflict trauma on us. If you are a narcissist, you're probably inflicting trauma on yourself or the people in your life. Like, again, trauma comes from a lot of places, both externally and internally. And I like that, Zach Cregger with this movie has said, I'm not going to sit here and allow myself to sit in my trauma and grief without a way to process it. And I like that in making weapons, he's able to externally process his grief of the passing of his friend. And, by also getting to externally process some of the grief from his childhood. I mean, again, he's talked about the third act of the film being deeply autobiographical. And the third act of the movie is the most intense act in terms of watching Alex's parents stab themselves in the face with forks, the children ripping the parents, Gladys, their kind of, witch mother, fairy godmother or witch godmother, as it were, apart at the end of the movie. Her getting her comeuppance, that all takes place in the third act. Alden Ehrenreich and Austin Abrams getting shot and killed. That takes place in the third act. The third act is intense, but the third act also, I think, is, a lot of, again, if you want to talk about processing external trauma, we get to see these children who represent, children from so many aspects of media, be it kids who have been shot in school shootings or children who have disappeared because of, predators, sexual predators or child predators kidnapping them. We get to see them, making good on all of the revenge that those children never get to get in real life in cinematic form, watching them rip this woman apart. I mean, it is cathartic. Again, Zach Cregger's script is cathartic, but then also the end of the film is cathartic. We get to go on a journey with these characters. We get to see Josh Brolin and Julia Garner by the end of the movie really coming full circle as characters. Josh Brolin, he saves Julia Garner, but then he almost kills her, but then the kids save all of them. Alex saves everybody. Again, you go back to the Lord of the Rings with, the smallest among us makes the biggest impact. Alex ultimately saves the day. Alex is the one who gets revenge on the witch. Again, he is Hansel pushing the witch into the oven. There's no Gretel in this movie. If anything, you almost have, adult Hansel and Gretel with Julia Garner and Josh Brolin. And then, Alex is, again, an interesting character. And you can see how Zach Cregger almost Deus Ex Machina as Alex, because Alex, in being in the house the whole time, he's the only one who would ever know how to undo what's been done. He's the precocious, observant child. And again, you can kind of see how he's having to fend for himself constantly, and he's having to look out for himself, and no one else is looking out for him. And the longer the movie goes on, the more self-sufficient he has to become to, by the end of the movie, he saves the adults who are too busy fighting each other or trying to stop one another from, killing the other to do anything about it. And, in a lot of ways, Zach Cregger is probably making good on what he wishes he could have done when he was a kid. He probably wishes there was, some magical twig he could have wrapped somebody's hair around and snapped it and just fixed everything. And look, does killing Gladys in this movie fix everything? Not necessarily, but it fixes a lot. It fixes those 17 kids are able to go back to their homes. I don't understand why in the opening narration it says the kids never return home. I mean, I guess they literally never return home because they're changed, but at the same time, like the kids do return home. I don't understand why they say that they don't in the opening narration when by the end of the movie the kids do return, except some of them are in a worse state than others. I don't know. I enjoyed this movie. I do think, we're getting some bangers for horror movies in the last couple years, and they really are elevating the genre way beyond anything I thought could be possible. And that's also because, again, you have Josh Brolin and Julia Garner and these like really, fantastic actors looking beyond the expectations of themselves and looking at horror as less something that, we have to do this because early on in our career, nobody would take us seriously, but as something where Josh Brolin is the executive producer of this film. I mean, he puts himself in this movie because Pedro Pascal had to drop out. And I don't understand how Pedro Pascal would have been in this movie in any, I don't need to see Pedro Pascal in everything. And this movie would have been a lesser film for having him in it because Josh Brolin's serious and intense energy is really appreciated. And I think for me, it's the best thing in this movie is Josh Brolin. And again, and how he interacts with everybody. I mean, Josh Brolin and Julia Garner, but Josh Brolin, I think for me, one of my favorite actors, period. But I just am so glad that horror is finally kind of getting its due. We have Alien Earth right now is on TV. It's, the most successful, thing that's going on FX right now. And it's a horror property. It's based on a horror film from the 70s, for fuck's sake. That's still popular now because it resonated with people. Zach Cregger talked about making a sequel to Weapons. And, I could see that. I mean, again, this movie clearly resonated with people in a way that I'm not saying Barbarian didn't, but I think this movie there's something about this movie that hit more people the right way. And in not only the right way, but the way that I think Zach Cregger really wanted it to hit them, this movie hit them. And I think it's the kids of it all. I think it's the parents. I think because you have the parents' perspective, because you have the kids' perspective, that split perspective, because we get a perspective that, again, we get a lot of perspectives in this movie. I really appreciate that. Because again, for me, I want to know why characters tick. And I want to know why Alex is the way that he is in a way that makes sense, that doesn't over-explain everything. And, narration is an easy way to do that. And then when it's done well, you have a show like Dexter, where the whole show really works because we get to know what's in Dexter's head, or something like The House That Jack Built, where, again, we get to know what's going on in the character's head. That works better than just, having a long leg scene where we're having a character talk to the audience directly and regurgitate this is what you've been seeing for the last hour. Yeah. And now we're just going to explain it. Yeah, okay, fine. This way of telling that story, I find it to be a lot more successful and, just not beating the audience over the head. And Weapons is as guilty of it as any of these kind of horror movies have been, but I think Weapons does a lot more right. I mean, even more so than Long Legs. As much as I liked Long Legs, which I enjoyed Long Legs a lot, I think this movie has a lot, no pun intended, longer legs than Long Legs will in terms of making an impact broadly with the horror community and with a larger audience. I think this movie got more people through the door than Long Legs did, and I think that this movie's marketing was more successful than Long Legs because I think the movie that was advertised is the movie that people saw, and I think Long Legs was misadvertised, which can kill a movie, and I think Long Legs suffered tremendously from misadvertising. This movie did not. The expectations with this movie were set correctly, and this movie executed in every way possible. And again, the amount of money that this movie has made, I think it speaks volumes to that. So I think for me, Weapons is a movie that in a lot of ways is Barbarian, but with a second and third pass having been done. There's still a lot of the themes of Barbarian, of generational trauma being put on you by other people. What does trauma look like? How does trauma affect us in the short term and the long term? I think it's all here in Weapons like it was in Barbarian. I just think in this movie, it's more interesting. I think what we're talking about is more interesting, and the conversation we're having is just a little bit more engaging. And I want to have engaging conversations with filmmakers through their film, through the medium that they want to have engaging conversations with the audience, which is film. I mean, we can talk to filmmakers. We used to do that all the time on the Kulturecast. My friend Mike White and co-collaborator on, co-founder on Weirding Way Media, he talks to filmmakers all the time. Like, to talk to them directly is one thing, but when you're watching a film, and especially one where it's written and directed by the same person, you're having a conversation directly with the filmmaker. And what better way to do it than with a filmmaker who has something interesting to say? And I think Zach Cregger does have something interesting to say. I think for me, in a lot of ways, I'm still waiting to see the further refinement of that message without having to lay it all out in the third act. And I think maybe his next film will do that. But maybe it won't, and it'll still be a further refinement of this with that kind of third act reveal, which I would still be okay with, because his tone resonates with me. I think his idea of how to be external with your catharsis matters to me as well, and means a lot to me. And, as someone who struggles with mental health, which, it's not an addiction, but it does tear at the fiber of your being and weaken your ability to operate on a daily basis in a substantive way, the way addiction seemingly does, at least when people talk about it. It's just another thing that makes you vulnerable. And vulnerability, especially, it's one thing to be honest about being vulnerable. It's another thing to struggle with being vulnerable. And vulnerability, comes in a lot of forms. And to open up and be honest with people about what you're struggling with, be it addiction, be it mental health, is to show vulnerability. And, Zach Cregger, again, opens up that, this movie is him externalizing his grief. That is not, something you're seeing a lot of filmmakers saying on a daily basis in Hollywood, that this is, my grief being externalized. And, I lost my friend, and so I just started writing. Like, I appreciate that honesty from him as a filmmaker, because that honesty is apparent in his, in his end product in the films that he's making. And I don't foresee him changing the way he does things anytime soon. Similarly to Jordan Peele and these other directors, like they are part and parcel with the film that they're making. And, I appreciate that. And I appreciate someone who has something to say about addiction and trauma and grief. And if you have any interest in checking this movie out, if you're on the fence, I would say give it a watch. Give it a look. If horror is not your strong suit, it's not as much of a horror movie as Barbarian was. There are horrific moments in this film, but I think in this day and age, like, not watching something because it might scare you, like the real world is scary enough. This is a kind of horror that you can experience in the safety of your own home, in the kind of sanctity of your own home, and it's just a screen. Enjoy it for the genre that it is, not because it's trying to scare you. And look, if the movie does scare you, that's also kind of the intention, to be fair. So, I don't know what we're going to be talking about on the next episode of the Kulturecast. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening to me for the last hour talk about weapons. If you've enjoyed this, like, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or leave me a comment on Spotify, or engage with me over at the Patreon, patreon.com/Kulturecast. That is where you can go to support the show financially, and you should, because times are hard and, we got to move the needle somehow. And yeah, head on over to weirdingwaymedia.com to check out all the other shows that I'm on, including this one, including Scary Stories We Tell, which is on hiatus right now, including The Shabby Detective, and including the Kolchak tapes. So many things, so many great things you could be checking out over at weirdingwaymedia.com, and you should. So thank you as always for listening, and I will catch you on the next episode.